probably have come across the slogan, "The personal is political," which is a feminist approach or slogan that speaks to how they identify issues relating to their rights, issues relating to their body, and equality rooted in the politics of society, specifically the power relations in a society. So when they were thinking about the personal is political, they were saying that when you look at how our rights are enjoyed, how our rights are asserted in a society, you will notice that it's not so much as people tend to believe a distinction between the public sphere and the private sphere, because the politics and lawmakers tend to encroach so much into our private life, into our marriages, into our the way we raise our children and so forth. So they said that we needed to now make sure that we highlight the fact that there is no distinction between the private sphere and the personal and the public sphere, in order to ensure that we are able to highlight the extent to which the patriarchal order has made inroads into our lives by collapsing the two. So there are strategies from there onwards to say, make sure that you don't regulate my body the way you would regulate public roads, because the two are not supposed to be regulated in that fashion. So because the law made sure that regulating public roads and regulating women's bodies are more or less the same thing, in the sense that they will deny a woman to do what she thinks is best with her body. For example, when it comes to termination of pregnancy by choice, of course, I don't know whether or against weight, they will do the authority, now that they put it aside. So those are the approaches that they had and that they took in order to make inroads into the patriarchal nature. So you see that challenging the dichotomy between the private sphere and the public sphere, where there's always an assumption that it exists, but when you look at it closely, you realize that in actual fact it does not exist. Made it possible that the feminists would then make sure that they redefine politics, especially in liberal democracies, by ensuring that there is a clear acknowledgement of the fact that if we go further, then we are entering into the private sphere as opposed to the public sphere. So far, this is what we have learned, and then what the LGBTIQ+ movement focuses on. The strategies, everyone is taught about LGBTIQ+ rights. I don't think governments can claim anymore that they're not aware of these issues. Many people are involved. Of course, it's a long road. In Botswana, it started as far back as 2008. That's when we started the Decree case, and ended a year or 2 years, a year ago. So this is despite that everyone knows that LGBTIQ issues are relevant to the protection of government's policies. We always fought with government to say, you need to acknowledge LGBTIQ because it affects our HIV/AIDS policies and strategies. So if you don't, then we are not going to have targeted approaches to this. The point is, this is what we know, and has it worked? I don't think it has sufficiently worked. And maybe it's because we are thinking that we are using law, human rights specifically, to solve this problem, when in actual fact, law does not have enough tools to resolve this. With laws that do not belong in the 21st century. And when we look at this, it's clear. The courts are saying this is an invasion, right? But somehow, no one is alive to the fact that the public should not have so much sway. Of course, public opinion is relevant to decisions in constitutional law and human rights issues. but it is not supposed to be the overriding factor. What is very clear is that the decisions relating to LGBTIQ rights are not decided by rules relating to the private sphere, but rules relating to the public sphere. And this is despite the fact that in Botswana, President Mogae was not willing to change the law because he was afraid of losing elections. So when President Masisi came in, he immediately embraced issues relating to LGBTI, but he didn't lose elections somehow. So I think if we put that across as often, then we should be able to make that point. There are issues that we should think about. One of the issues is that we inherited these religions, but somehow we are the ones who are championing it more than the owners of these religions, which is very, very strange. Why are our traditional leaders indifferent? Is it because it doesn't bother them? And if it doesn't, then it means it should not bother us, because they are our embodiment of our culture and thinking. Why is it that of all the issues, of all the many contentious issues in Africa, why is it this is the only one that Africans are willing to stand up to the West, to even endanger their populations due to the possibility, not possibility, in Uganda, many programs have been discontinued because of the adoption of and all of this is political. If you find the answer to why they are willing to, then it's political mileage. They know that they won't be able to assert themselves in other avenues. So to them, there's a low-hanging fruit which does not have any political ramifications so much. So it becomes easier for them to simply assert themselves when it comes to LGBT. So we need to think about it from political
So we'll talk about protection. Basically, we start by looking at the law. And the law can be used in two forms, depending on how we want to use the law. It can become an instrument of oppression, and also become an instrument of liberation, instrument of order, depending on the way we apply the law. So its content and the manner in which it is applied is very, very important. So within the South Africa, these are three major legislation. There could be others that also can be applied or used in the fight against human trafficking. So you have the Child Act, the criminal law, sexual offenses and related matters, and the prevention and combating of human trafficking in persons. So this three for me, stands out. The other two, the first two, we have been used before 2013, when the specific national legislation was adopted. And the first one to protect the rights of children as provided by the Constitution, and also to combat trafficking in children. Return, and the government gives relief to the victims who cooperate with the state in terms of prosecuting human traffickers or suspected human traffickers. But if you're not cooperating with the government, I think in many cases we'll have instances in which people are deported. And this is also against the provisions of the law. But the law is one thing, the practice is another thing. And Home Affairs also, I think in Home Affairs now we have backlog of papers, so not processed. So human trafficking victims are the part the most affected here. So what are the gaps? Okay, despite commendable effort by the African government, we also have there are still gaps in what needs to be done. The front line workers have been trained police and so on. They've been complaining of lack of communication and coordination between them, especially agencies, particularly police and the Department of Social Development, because despite a person as a human trafficking victim is done by the Department of Social Development. So sometimes they will disagree with the police on the criteria of bringing somebody to death. What we need to do. I think why the laws are necessary to help us solve intractable problems such as human trafficking. Experience has also shown that we cannot always legislate our ways out of problems. And yes, the law is limited in certain aspects and needs to be complemented by other strategies. So if we criminalize, we can arrest, prosecute, and imprison offenders, but we cannot solve the problem of vulnerability to poverty. So in trying to address the issue of criminalization of human trafficking, we should also look at ways through which we can solve the problem of poverty. because poverty is one of, not really a causal factor, but at least there is a correlation between human trafficking and poverty. So the law therefore needs to be implemented by poverty alleviating measures targeting the most vulnerable persons and areas of human trafficking oppression. What are some of these poverty alleviation measures? Let me see if I mention one. Look, I talked about victim restitution, which is in the law, and for human trafficking victims to be compensated. But I don't think, to the best of my knowledge, that any judge has passed a law. I mean, so has passed a judgment that we should compensate victims, although some prosecutions and the convictions have been done. So I don't think this one has been implemented. I'm speaking on that correction. So the question of human affairs should accord priority. Okay. That one is a mistake there, but it's fine. To victims in issuing temporary permits, we find that there's sometimes human trafficking victims are not issued permits because their status is not determined, and especially if they are not cooperating with government and the state done investigation and prosecution, they are just left like that. And before you know it, they're in Nidela. From Nidela, they disappear, they go home, and sometimes they're not accounted for. You see, so these are some of the challenges that in practice that human trafficking fight experience. So there is also need for proactive screening of to improve identification. Sometimes we just when new people are brought into the committee, or there's always a body that is unit specifically within the police that is specifically assigned to work and identify human trafficking victims and to prosecute them and so on. But sometimes you find out that after 1 week training already in the field, and some of them do not understand what to do. So this has been a big challenge, and they need some time to work with experienced people. And most of the experienced people are redeployed. And the police also do not have enough resources on its own. Now, also making available like vehicles and phones and things like that, gadgets that can help in the fight against human trafficking are not supplied that unit. So they also complain about a lack of resources. So again, we have the fear of foreigners extending immigration protection, which is people often make that argument. Make that argument. Okay, so I think these are some of the some of these ones that I've already mentioned in passing also. I think this is the end of my presentation.
That if you start to unpack each of these elements, each of the elements are also relative. Because, depriving someone of their childhood is also not universal, right? We know that childhood is not universal. The state of being a child is, yes, everybody has been a child, but childhood is not universal. We all have different experiences of childhood. And then the potential and dignity, of course, is again a whole wide issue because there are certain aspects of child work that are important for development of potential. And at what point is the threshold of supporting, child development and harm? Not that these factors are not considered; they are, even by the CRC, and they are articulated in certain places, but they are not consistent. So we don't have really a uniform framework. But I think the last part, which I'm sure Elvis alluded to significantly, for within the child rights sector, the biggest problem is the blurry line between child work and child labor. And the distinction between child work and child labor, particularly for legal purposes, but also for more like policy at policy level. At what point do you actually legislate child labor and not child work? But it's also the politics of labor. In the origins of before industrialization or around industrialization, child labor was considered because it was actually cheap. And children are more effective at certain things, particularly refined skills. You know, this is starting to sound very wrong, but it is true. Children, it is documented that because children have smaller hands, they are very good with fine labor. And that is one of the points of exploitation. But the point is they do it good and for cheaper. So if you don't have equal pay and the cost, the real cost of child labor, in the sense that children get paid less, but also the opportunity cost that is not very evident, that if you subject children to labor right now, you pay in the longer term in terms of lack of development and skill. So obviously child labor is a symptom of a bigger problem. The reference to modern forms of slavery is one of the reasons that discourse died. Why? Because Africans have a very different history and comprehension of slavery. And to now propose that certain practices happening right now equate to slavery. A very uncomfortable discourse on the African continent, particularly to the African Union, you know? So it's not, it's the insensitivity. It was, in fact, when people are talking in the sidelines of the presentation, I'm like, no, this is not slavery. We know what slavery is. You know, we know what slavery is. So there's a disconnect between the global discourse and the local reality of how people actually characterize some of these things. Yeah, they are very general, but they also, they lack a certain specificity that is also reflective of certain circumstances that find themselves in Africa. I think if you look at Article 32, the language of Article 32 of the CRC and Article 15 of the African Children's Charter is almost the same, but significantly, that language is closely tied to the ILO conventions, the conventions, not the recommendations, the conventions. So the language is very minimalist. It just talks about minimum age of admission to employment, regulation of the hours and conditions, and providing for penalties. The same thing you see when it talks about the African Children's Charter, it talks about the same thing, talking about covering, every child shall be protected from economic exploitation. Is much the same fashion as the ILO conventions would say. Significantly, the African Children's Charter talks about covering both the formal and the informal sectors of employment. I don't know why that was important to mention the formal and informal sectors. Maybe because in the African region, actually these things work better more in the informal sectors. But yeah, the rest of this part looks at it from a legislative point of view. Why are these things significant? I mean, in addition to the provision itself, there is, of course, child labor is a question of harmful practices. Okay, and child labor is something that is tied to the best interest of the child as a general principle, and whether it enhances it or not. Child labor is tied to sexual exploitation. I think that was mentioned in the presentation even before, but particularly within the African region, the committee has pronounced itself very significantly around sexual exploitation, particularly in tourism in the African continent. It's a big issue. Then protection from recruitment in armed conflicts and protection from abuse and neglect. Essentially, child labor goes beyond the two provisions that we have. So what's the problem? So there's African contextual realities, our African contextual realities, are a bit at odds with the data collection frameworks. Now I've been told I have no time, so I can't do any more elaboration on that. But I think in terms of, I think we need to critique the data sources and versus the contextual realities of how we understand child labor. What are the limits of, because I saw, for instance, in some of the documents, someone said that herding is a hazardous form of labor. My eyes just went, phew. Because I used to herd. It's a hazardous form of labor. Okay. But I mean, the point is, we Africans need to engage with this thing. And I think we can wholesale by the discourse on child labor without actually applying ourselves and not getting bogged down into the very basic fight between work and labor. That is the least of the problems. The bigger problems have to do with areas that influence policy and responses, and within which our countries are always listed as not meeting the minimum criteria. But in closing, yes, I think child labor can be classified as a wicked problem. And I think that the current normative approaches presume a very linear presentation of child labor that is not consistent with our actual.
to a problem. I think one of the problems, how significant a problem this is, and how significant it is to Africa and our region. And yeah, we start as scary. This is the only time how you start. But then when you look at the UNICEF and ILO reports, their global statistics of child labor, you say in sub-Saharan Africa, more than 1 in 4 children aged between 5 and 17 are engaged in child labor. And the global population of the estimated population in child labor is 160 million, and out of which 79 can be categorized to be doing hazardous work. Then there's a high incidence in boys than girls, I think due to the nature of the work. And we'll go back to the issue of child marriage. I think child marriage is child labor. And it's more common in rural areas. Most of the child labor is in agriculture, but there's good literature that also suggests that there is, in West Africa, a significant population affected in the mines, out in the mines. And the largest share takes place within families, which I think eventually, I hope that I'll argue why we don't engage the people affected and why we think we do better. But then when you look at why child labor still is breaking the record to the 160 million and 79 million in being hazardous, I think you can see that there are conditions which enable it to thrive. So the first one is, characteristics of families. When you read it, you see that they're poor, and usually the lower tribes and lower castes in the society, yes, they are the underprivileged and the marginalized groups. And these poor households are able to meet their needs. They can't get enough money or enough resources to survive. And they look at, that's a belief, some of them, they want to send their children to supplement, income. And, there are times, not all the time, when this is probably their only choice. But, there's literature also which has argued that this is an excuse, because in the same communities, there are adults who are unemployed. So maybe there's another model of getting income community or families. In the same family, the same children work, and there are adults who are working. But I think that's a simplistic way of understanding why some people who have no choice make these choices. The second one, which is also related to this, is the industries themselves. They're looking for profit, and labor by children is cheap and sometimes unpaid. So it increases the profit base. But secondly, extended to that, children are easy to manage and lead, so much that they cannot organize the labor union, they cannot resist, they cannot negotiate, so they are an easy target. Of course, in India, children are by the industry, they are also looked at debt. Someone had debt with a company, took a loan, and they can't pay, so they send their children as collateral for that behalf. Keep in mind, this is not to say that the law is bad, but I think the law can be complemented by other strategies. And I think we can learn from nation sociologists, right? So I think I subscribe to talking about how the law is, how human rights go beyond the law, how human rights, we have to conceptualize, we have to protest, we have to fight over, and we have to negotiate within society that's going up. And I think that helps us to pay attention to the particular area of context, but the drivers, the underlying drivers of why child labor seems to, let's say, beat the law. I think by doing that, we also somehow prioritize the agency of the people affected, because I don't think they're hearing about their voices enough, and their problems enough, and their realities enough. Maybe that way we'll be able to find solutions which are locally legitimate, that's great, but then at the same time practical and applicable. Maybe then the law itself will exist, but other strategies will be used to enable it. Lastly, on that, I have in mind, which I'll still work on how the law itself will make definitions for us, but then we use the law and frame the interventions as human rights. Let's say others have said, let us do poverty reduction, let us do education of children, let us do public awareness, let us do anti-trafficking. whether to anti-corruption or whether to play local politics in the way that addressing each other. But the interesting to me that when I was reading about this topic, I could see a lot of pronouncements of child labor in the law, but in the agenda 20 something, there isn't, which was interesting as well. In the development blueprint, it's unequal. It says no, it's implied. Not there. So it shows where politically.